Hey all, I'd just like to share a few thoughts on the way that senior leadership in university should be thinking about AI and the ways that AI will drive and eventually make an impact on the sector as a whole. Like most people, the advent of generative AI has proved to be an opportunity that both is exhilarating to see capabilities, but also a growing amount of anxiety about is the process that drives modern education the right one? Are we teaching the right things in our classrooms? And are we preparing learners for the type of future that they need to engage in with the kind of skills that they need in order to be successful? So I put together a few thoughts, and this comes out of a number of discussions I've had over the last several years, over the last 5 or 7 years actually, about university leadership and ways that universities should strategically respond to AI. So I'm talking to a very specific audience because in some ways that's the audience that to date has been the most disappointing in their response to the opportunities that these emerging technologies enable. This came off of a presentation I did to the CalState Board of Trustees earlier this year, where I was trying to make the argument that the way that we think about AI needs to be strategic, it needs to be intentional, and it needs to be centered on the learner rather than favoring sort of a technology that someone brings into our universities or something that's being layered onto an existing cloud platform provider. The My orientation is that systems level change is required in order to properly respond to what can be done with AI. And this has been a theme really for my academic career, from earliest thinking around network learning and connectivism through to open online courses or MOOCs, to learning analytics, and over the last while related to AI and the effects of AI. Particularly over the last 2 years, I've been working with Paul LeBlanc, former president of Southern New Hampshire University, around imagining what a university would look like that's primarily AI centric and one that favors the development of the whole human as part of the academic process. So I'm going to talk about three things. I'll move fairly quickly through each of those items, but want to get across a bit of a grounding on what AI is and why what AI is so consequential to what it is that we do within our university system. And in many ways, the slides I do in the last probably 10 minutes are most relevant for leadership because they're the ones that are trying to advocate for reasons for systemic change and approaches to systemic change. But it's hard to get to that part of the conversation without first paying attention to what it is that AI is creating, enabling in our modern life, if you will. So, starting with what is AI? And I think in some regards, humanity has confined intelligence to this fairly small slice of what we can do cognitively and in some cases logically. And there's a number of thinkers who have advocated for the idea of intelligence across the universe, intelligence in nature, intelligence within the plant and animal kingdom as well. The reality is that the sliver of intelligence that we advocate for and treasure most, in some ways, are the ones that are most readily taken over by AI. And that's a challenge because AI learns faster than we do. It takes us 18 to 20 some years to bring a human being to a state of knowledge that helps them at either advance science or contribute substantively in the modern economy. But as you're likely aware of, if a Waymo in San Francisco learns something, 30, 40, 50,000 Waymos have all learned the same thing. We don't have that transferability across species. And so that means it's a very intensive process to provide that level of understanding or education. And in some ways, we're talking about a shift where we need to move from epistemological orientation in the university sector to ontological. And by epistemological, we're talking about knowing and states of knowing. I'm not trying to denigrate that or say it's not relevant. Clearly, it is. You're not going to get a job if you're a programmer who doesn't know basic data structures or the basic concepts of software engineering. But the reality is that as AI does more of those types of activities, such as coding or even some level of data analysis, the more critical it becomes that we add a type of a cognitive escalation to the learning process. So we add more value and more insights into what it is that learners actually do in our classroom. And this is a shift to ontology or beingness, for lack of a different word, where we're putting our emphasis and the focus on the character of the learner, the metacognitive capabilities of the learner, rather than just simply what the learner knows. And at some level, this aspect of AI is the thing that should change the entirety of the university process and experience. Now, when we talk innovation, it's worth looking at, say, Rocket as an early illustration. By itself, it was a marking point in human history. But if you step back a little bit, and it was essentially a process of tying connections from really across history. And that new knowledge builds on existing knowledge. And any type of innovation is essentially the equivalent of thousands of threads of innovation that can run hundreds or even thousands of years. So even when we're talking about AI and novel effects of AI, it's still worth emphasizing that this grounding of history that comes together in this modern technology is more like stitching together known parts rather than creating something from scratch. This little insight is particularly consequential because generative AI does this extremely well, or the current flavor of AI, the foundation models, does this very well because they're capable of pulling together and stitching together knowledge that in many cases we as humans can't see in their totality the way that AI can. And even with our somewhat limited scope of comprehension and ability to absorb huge amounts of information, the simple example of Rocket reflects multiple aspects of science and history coming together that resulted in the creation of this particular innovation. And it wasn't just in that decade or even in that century, it really goes back to the starting point in human history. So the connection forming capabilities of AI is what we're fundamentally focusing on. And this is where AI succeeds. And you've seen numerous examples already where new math formulas, new algorithms can be invented simply because, for lack of a better framing, AI has a lens on information that is structurally different in terms of sheer computational width than what human capability ends up being. The part that is interesting in this regard, though, is that the biological systems fail to keep up with the pace of technology systems. And so as a result, we are at a point where we acquiesce more and more cognitive capability to these systems that are accelerating and beginning to take on a greater component or a module of the human cognitive framework. Now, that's not to say that people like Karen Howe or Emily Bender and others who rightly call out the overhype of AI aren't relevant critiques. But it is to say that even with the capabilities that we have now, with language, with writing, with coding, that these types of technologies will eventually take over large swaths of human cognitive or human knowledge work as it is today. And so we get to a point where the abundance that we experience today, and if you haven't yet, you'll feel it in your social media timelines in the next several months, but the abundance of information, the easy ability to create videos and images and text is consuming human attention. And so we get to the point where we have to place greater value on those things that are unique to us, the parts that AI perhaps short term is unable to compete and perhaps in the long run will always be unable to compete. So let's step back. So that's the problem. The problem is AI is competitive in the domain on which the modern university develops the human learner. And we need to look around to see what is the thing that our universities should be developing in learners so that we continue to advocate in favor for learner-centric university education and, for that matter, just human-centric life. So how did we get here? Well, this has been done to death now, but this is the Dartmouth Summer Research Project that advanced a pretty simple hypothesis or conjecture, which is that all aspects of learning, or even any feature of intelligence, can be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. This produced a flurry of activity, often catastrophically wrong, such as by when a computer would outperform a human being at chess. But eventually, the arc of these predictions has held largely true. Even early examples, such as a agent, if you will, an early agent that served as a psychotherapist, and the ways that humans would begin to engage or feel responsive to that agent, which today are manifest in a much more sophisticated way, even with therapy bots. But early on, the indications are that people are willing to engage with, talk to, and have some kind of an relationship, if you will, with a type of an intelligence, not necessarily human intelligence, but it at least possesses and has attributes of intelligence. And so, going right from the sequence of events back to the 50s, from the ability for machines to think, the famous Turing test, through to innovations, stalled innovations such as the AI forecast, public events such as Deep Blue in the 1990s, Watson in 2011, and many of the things we experience today, from voice agents or tools that we have within our home. There's sort of been this steady march of the improvement of AI in domains that human beings have traditionally been exclusively competitive. Some of this has been fantastically useful, could be related to spam, social recommendations, content recommendations, great for medical imaging, and so on. And you hear these four buckets of terms thrown around, and they're probably best seen as types of Russian nested dolls, if you will, from deep learning to neural networks to machine learning and then AI. Now, AI is obviously the big concept that can include everything from robotics to the algorithms that are being used. But for our purposes, we want to focus on really the legacy of generative AI as we experience it today. So the revolution really is based in three particular events, and that is around algorithms, around data, and computing capacity, and probably best represented by NVIDIA, AlexNet, and ImageNet. The idea, ImageNet being a curated data set, AlexNet, sort of the neural network approach, and NVIDIA being the obviously GPUs that now underpin much of the modern neural network or deep learning kinds of approaches. The classic paper, Attention is All You Need, shaped the way that we come to understand the idea of next token prediction, in that it's not simply anticipating the next word, but it's continually feeding back the context that came before so that the next token prediction is significantly more accurate. That produced foundation models, which is GPT-4 or Gemini 2.5 or Mistral or any of the tools that are now prominent on our phones or in our laptops, are essentially models that have the capability to feel intelligent-ish. If we ask, say, Midjourney to create images, it can produce surprisingly realistic images. You ask certain tools to create videos or even music, any kind of a concept that has core training in the model that is then repurposed for multiple varied outputs is still within that domain. Obviously, a pure image model can't suddenly produce a range of text. Multimodal or multimedia models can produce multiple kinds of outputs, but an image output of an image model makes a bunch of sense, but it can output a range as many ways as we can think of an image. So if you want, outlandishly creative ideas, it can, to a degree, produce them. And so these are large models that are trained on achieving particular tasks. Right now with Gemini and certainly OpenAI, multimodality is more the norm, as these will include video, audio, text, and other outputs to provide a richer component for the learner. But all these are essentially based on this type of a deep learning model, or a neural network, if you will, where the essential input is processed through these ranges of billions of parameters to be able to accurately predict, or accurately, in our case, generate novel outputs. Similar examples have come with going back to 2017 with initially, at that point it was DeepMind, now Google, but AlphaGo was the first tool that defeated humans at Go, or the first technology, AlphaGo Zero came along and was trained differently. Rather than being given a range of examples of previous games or configurations of a board, it was given basic rules without a lot of input, and in a short period of time was able to defeat the model, AlphaGo, that beat Lee Sedol. And so you're starting to see this idea of modern or novel algorithms, novel approaches can rapidly increase the overall capability of AI. So anytime you have a significant leap in either data, computation, or the algorithms that are used, you have the ability to see rapid acceleration. And so this process is essentially one where, as the technology, the AI itself gets better, there's actually a recursive or effect back on humans, which resulted in a paper from a few years ago that said as individuals played with AI, they gained increased capabilities of those AI technologies, meaning AI makes us smarter at some level as well. And we saw a similar pattern with this earlier this year with DeepSeek, when suddenly it was able to produce significant results for a much cheaper trained model that mirrored many of the state-of-the-art models at the time, with just taking different algorithmic approaches. So we're seeing this leapfrogging of innovation through data, computation, or algorithms constantly as AI advances. But if you just step back a little bit, what I'm trying to get across here is this idea that AI directly competes with what we do in our modern universities. So if you go back and look at, and this is from EFF, this is since a sort of a site they no longer maintain, but they kept a series of resources on where different tools, different AI technologies exceeded at some level of human performance. So the red dotted line here is human performance in terms of error rates. And at some point, different algorithms outperform humans. Same thing with successful image recognition. So percentages correct in this case, the red dotted line is human performance. And these AI systems at domain after domain exceed our capabilities, whether it's reading, image recognition, chess. This is reading comprehension, drastically outdated now with the advancements with foundation models. But you can see point after point, we are seeing AI advance beyond human capabilities in cognitive tasks that we've always felt that creativity would be the domain of humans. And generative AI has somewhat shattered that general illusion. And this came from the EFF report on AI progress. But what's interesting is as you see LLMs or as you see different models perform at levels that exceeds the human baseline, whether it's in image classification, visual reading, English understanding, even approaching competition level mathematics, we're seeing again one domain after another where AI ticks and outperforms at a human level. Now, this is where I have to briefly pause and rant at boards and presidents and provosts because we're not in the game as universities. Like we're peripheral watching one of the most foundational events in human history unfold, and we're not in the game. And so, just look at a simple example, a report that came out of UK last year. Like, who are the partners here, right? I mean, it's the big tech. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Nvidia, some of the smaller labs out there. I mean, OpenAI is no longer smaller, but it was at one time. But you're seeing Hugging Face, the open source community, and other examples, Anthropic, that are out there producing some of these resources and these effects. Now, you could argue and say, well, okay, but these are our students. These are PhDs from our universities. And of course, that's a fair counterpoint. But the argument really is that we, as higher education, are observers to these fundamental innovations happening. And we need a coherent strategy and response so that we can kind of respond to these rapid escalations of models for human capability. Now there's, a handful of what you'd probably best classify as frontier models, the ones that are in the game and are out competing one another. All of the ones on the screen here. There's a few, Mistral from Open Source Lens, out of Europe that probably should be added as well, and Quen and others coming out of China are worth noting too. But the point is, where are the universities as more active practitioners in it? Because I would argue that universities actually are the ones that are most impacted by AI advancement because the things that AI is doing are the things we develop students in, as I've said 72 times. So let's just briefly wrap up here before I talk about higher education impact. So, the trends in AI for just this year alone. Now we're halfway through the year, but the prevalence of AI on our devices, the development of reasoning models from O3 to Gemini models, the deep research framing. Grok has a research frame as well, multimodality, more open source, smaller models, which will be critical for on device or whether it's a phone or a laptop kind of work. A lot of attention on robotics. That may not quite be realized short term, but definitely the hype is building on robots, and especially where robots get coupled with vision or get coupled with LLMs for natural language exchange. For universities, there's a few things that particularly matter. I'll point out, 7, 9, and 10 in particular, but the frameworks. When we first started some of our earlier planning on how do we do AI-centric learning and human development, there weren't a ton of frameworks out there. You really had to figure everything out on your own, and for whatever mistakes you made, those were the mistakes that you would make. And over time, you'd solve a problem, and then someone would come out, say, let's say you've dealt with agent coordination, and then eventually OpenAI comes and provides a rudimentary framework for orchestrating agents. Or if you're trying to deal with some type of memory or context, one agent interacts with a learner to see, to teach the learner a topic, but then later on when it wants to assess the learner, there might be elements that were exchanged during the learning process as part of that dialogue that need to be brought back into assessment. So now you have a problem of what does an agent know or memory? And again, similar things are kind of being developed over time by these big providers. So we're seeing rapid maturation of frameworks, which is very good news for universities because it means you can get in and start building AI tools immediately. This is, at your doorsteps now. And if you aren't building AI products right now, I would say that's borderline negligent at some level. It's also worth noting that AI is more than just generative AI. It's not just the LLMs we're dealing with. There are a range of advancements I'll talk about shortly that go beyond just LLMs. So it's worth noting between robots and other applications, especially as related to understanding disease and finding cures for things that plague humanity. There's significant advancement going on those fronts as well. And point to emphasize here, definitely agents. Like agents is a theme of the year. Microsoft just yesterday, depending on when you're listening to this, but on May 19th, 2025, Microsoft had a series of agentic-centric announcements. Today, Google went out and dropped, again, a range of focus. So the agent domain is a critical battle space, and the protocols in the sector from Google's agent-to-agent approach to what initially was Anthropic's, but Model Context Protocol, there's a growing number of tech partners that are adopting these technologies, which is going to make it a lot easier for agents to communicate with one another and work together. So, what does this mean from higher education? So, if you agree with my hypothesis at some level that we're seeing AI's advancements compete with human capabilities, it has implications to the university sector. And I think two big implications that leadership needs to turn their attention to and answer definitively. One is what are the skills, knowledge, and ways of being that learners need to develop while they're in a university system so they can prepare for this automated, emerging world. The second one is how are you going to do that? What's the pedagogical model or the pedagogical framework that you're going to develop these skills and capabilities? You've all heard of Bloom's Two Sigma. You've all heard about the ways that modern agents or chatbots, if you will, depending on the situation, can actually help learners more so advance their knowledge capabilities than a human faculty member can. In some instances, of course, these are always contextually dependent, but how are we going to advance engaged, motivated learners that become better citizens of society through the use of AI? So if you just take a quick step back, we're seeing a lot of attention going to how AI is going to displace human labor, which means it's entirely possible work will be different in the future. I sometimes sit there when I'm reminiscing and can't sleep, wondering, like, what is it that is changing? Like, how are we going to earn in the future? I mean, really, you earn through assets, you earn through salary, or you might earn through, government programs. If if AI takes jobs, like what does that look like? And the idea of universal basic income and some of these concepts, it just seems so trite and so under discussed that I'm alarmed that universities aren't the ones aggressively clanging a bell that says, look, there's a societally broad conversation to be had. But by the same account, there's a lot of hype and BS, and there's been a number of books that have come out even in the last week that really start to attend to the idea of that hype. But a couple of examples. Last year, Klarna was bragging about how they're replacing all these workers with a big headcount reduction. They're using these AI tools, or they're using agents or assistants from OpenAI. But then it turns around and now they're starting to backtrack. And now they're starting to realize, oh, wait, the pendulum swung too far to no humans. And now they're sort of turning back and saying, all right, we didn't quite hit that. But that doesn't produce people from putting out alarming statements about, not hiring humans or mechanize, which just came out. I think I first read about it in April, which the goal is to really eliminate human work, period, by collecting data on the nature of human work, training models on human work, and then essentially replacing humans. We already have groups like Google, Microsoft, and Meta saying that up to 30% of all of their code is now being generated by AI. And even in our world of science and research, you're seeing examples of AI scientists that will do everything from generating the idea to experimenting to actually writing that paper. And this is from Sakana Labs last year. Google's AI co-scientist launched something comparable this year, which again means that we are less focused on having AI do something exclusively on our behalf, but much more focused on an integrative relationship with AI in its various forms. And the examples can be fantastic, such as what used to take months and years can be done in a weekend. And the ability to achieve and advance this as rapidly as it can be done now has surprising impacts for the acceleration of humanity. And what that means, even just from a psychological or that perspective of, are we able to feel like we are in control of the world that's emerging around us? But I do want to emphasize again, there's tools like, and this was just announced this week, Alpha Evolve, a Google or DeepMind output, which is essentially, an LLM that does some assessment or algorithmic testing and determination to see where improvements can be made and where the algorithms themselves can be optimized. So it's both a discovery and an optimization tool. If you see the growing number of coding companions, I think just last week, OpenAI purchased, Windsurf for $3 billion, and Cursor is now, I don't know how many billions they're valued at, but they're probably up to $9 to $12 billion in valuation based on fundraising that they've done, which potentially, and the concept of vibe coding you may have heard of, where you have a natural language interaction with the type of software you want to build. We're quickly realizing there's limitations to vibe coding and technical expertise matters. But the idea now is just to, kind of say, look, this is a significant emerging landscape of capability. We're seeing it in vehicles. We're seeing it in the arrival of robots. We are seeing its presence in devices. Meta's Ray-Ban smart glasses, Android XR, was just announced today, actually. So there's a lot of emerging data and emerging models that are going to have a very direct effect on what's happening in your university classrooms, labs, and lecture halls and on campuses. Even Fei Li's launch of One World Labs, she was the prof that was largely responsible for ImageNet, and it was her project, and she's been affiliated with Google. Prof at Stanford leads the Human Artificial Intelligence Institute, which is a very large initiative, and she's turning her attention to World Labs, the ability to create, generate, direct, interact in 3D worlds. In medical settings, you're seeing these models perform better than humans in many instances. In fact, some recent studies have suggested when AI partners with humans, it's actually worse than if it's by itself in terms of the results. An interesting one from about 2 months ago actually is the role of therapy chatbots and how well they actually work until a certain threshold. They hit a point and then all of a sudden something goes south in the relationship with the individual, extensive use, which can then lead to a decline in mental health. But it is an overstatement to think that AI cannot be an active and persistent emotional, intelligent, and even physical companion in terms of helping us as we move physically through the world as robots advance. So turning back to education, we did a paper a couple of years ago where we looked at human and artificial cognition. An argument was that as machines and humans start to interact within knowledge work, that we're going to have to turn our attention to the novel contributions that humans can make to this. And my focus would be heavily around learning, sense making, wayfinding, meaning making, and decision making. Those should be sort of core curricular outputs. But we took a step back, and this was led by a colleague, Melissa Bond, and she looked at how is AI reflected in the literature. And in the general overview, in terms of the topics that research, this was coming up just up to ChatGPT, but the type of AI research being conducted was heavily around adaptive systems for learning, personalization, profiles, assessment, or tutors, with a lot of challenges and benefits being articulated as ethics being a big challenge, personalized learning being a big outcome, and a range of concerns that relate to technical knowledge and capabilities, the shifting authority in classrooms, and so on. The research gaps, then pronounced, but still quite significant, are around ethical and methodological approaches in education, at least. I think certainly ethical and cultural implications and bias and fairness are front of mind as ongoing research concerns, certainly for the university sector. We did a paper in last year, actually, and this has been validated by other papers I've read over the last, certainly the last 6 months or so, which is AI is not always used to learn well. In many cases, it's a bit of a crutch, and students often use AI as something that they rely on rather than they learn from in terms of much of that process. Now, of course, quality learning designers will say the way you structure the learning, the type of activity they're doing will be a big determinant of the way that learners experience that technology in general. So, with that said, we do need a bit of a discussion as a sector around what is left for humans in this world of AI. And my earlier articulation that we need to shift from epistemology to ontology, I think is part of it. It's not the entirety of it. There is no single answer to this challenge. I've said before, I'd be happily content with a university president that says, we will use no AI anywhere, right? We are a principled, intentional decision to not use AI, I would respect. Some of the sleepwalking decisions to not use AI or to sign a contract with a big tech company and then assume by virtue of having done that that you've done your bit. That's harder to assume is the right approach to take. Simply because intentional focused strategy creation on how will AI help our learners succeed? How will AI help our faculty be more successful, our designers and our support staff be more capable, and ultimately, how will it prepare our learners to live privately happy and publicly useful lives? It's an adjustment of a Canadian education theorist I heard many years ago of a statement that he made. But I think the concept we do have to look at is what are we teaching in our classrooms and how are we teaching it? And these are just a few random lists, but I think any university, whether a university that perhaps has a more traditional liberal arts orientation or a community college that is giving a very practical skill to someone who's entering the workforce, or it's your R1 systems across the US or a top tier research university internationally, you do have to grapple with what is left for humans to do and how are you actually going to do it, teach it, and deploy it. So, what changes do you need to make? And this is a very specific call out now to senior leadership. So, again, your boards, your presidents, your provosts. All I would like to see is intentional planning and decision making for how you use AI that's grounded in the reality of the capability of AI and in the impact it's having on the labor market already. Now, the speculations have been there for a long time. Fay and Osborne, I think, wrote about this almost a decade ago. But it's not unlike, I would argue, what happened with chess. Early proclamations of chess taking over or computers taking over chess took a few decades to be realized. And we may be in the same position where early proclamations of job loss were premature and the capabilities of AI needed to continue to advance for society to be able to feel their effects more profoundly. So there's a few ways to adopt AI, obviously, and I'll unpack this shortly. But one is around the ability to do a point-based solution, a chatbot, an assessment agent, or something that solves a specific challenge. An application is more around an existing services that you'd like to use, where you're trying to build on an existing infrastructure. It's broader than just one problem or a point-based solution, but it's still not leading to sector level transformation. And for me, we've had a lot of discussions over the last 25 years that I've been in the university sector around sector-wide transformation, but it hasn't always been wrong. Like there has been dramatic change in the university sector in its adoption of AI. And so I think from an AI perspective, and I'll adopt this slightly in a few slides to clarify the ways that universities should be responding by tiers. But the reality is there's a lot of point-based solutions, very few sector-level transformations. There have been some discussions from a few universities, but by and large, that hasn't happened. So if you look at right now, this is, routine change that we could see happening currently, which is AI for advising, student support, type of a co-pilot, even adaptive feedback. That's already happening in many classrooms. There's a few campuses. University of Florida was one of the first to come out to do this. CalState similarly made a proclamation to move in this direction. Some of the traditional flag bearers of American higher education have been absent in bold proclamations or bold visions on what AI will do. So I found that to be somewhat surprising. But there are certainly campuses to look for that are aspirationally, intentionally using AI as sector level transformation. But ultimately, we do get to the point where we need to start thinking about what does AI change at a systems level? The idea of personal profiles or learning graphs, curriculum that's computed in real time versus everything being in a textbook that students access before. I don't think students need to be paying a lot for educational content anymore. I think much of what happens can now happen through AI generated content and curriculum. Labor market relevance, pathways to labor markets. How do we have relationships as a university sector to that labor market would be other important concepts to look at. Now, a lot of what's holding us back, and this is as a sector, is first of all, there's an architectural problem. We did a paper a number of years ago about data for artificial intelligence research, and our model there was that our current university sector doesn't have the right technological or the right data infrastructure to be able to provide real-time feedback and guidance to learners and to be able to impactfully deploy AI. I think in many cases, deploying AI on a weak or underdeveloped infrastructure will actually produce underwhelming results over time because those cracks eventually will become an issue. If you don't have, say, a well-architected model of what you know about your students, if you're going to start to feed some of that context about a student into a systems prompt in an LLM to personalize a learning experience, you're going to have a problem if your data house is kind of mucked up and not in proper form. There's a big skill shortage. I've spent quite a bit of time in the 2019, 2020, 21 talking about the faculty skill development and faculty literacies that need to be advanced in order to be active within the AI landscape. For some, there's an innovation fatigue point as well. We're just sick of yet another new idea, and we're sick of yet another transformation that's going to change everything. But I really think the biggest challenge is around leadership and vision. It's hard for me to overstate the silence and how odd it feels that this systems level silence from the higher education sector has been as profound as it's been. And it's not just within the US, it's a global thing. I haven't seen it out of Australia. I haven't seen it out of UK. I haven't seen it out of Europe. It is, I haven't seen it coming out of really any region of the world where I would say this university gets the impact that AI will have on how we know and are intelligent as human beings and how that'll ripple into the labor market. I've yet to see that. So that's why part of the motivation for this somewhat long lecture is to try and get this idea out was, hey, this is a mandate that you need to tackle or show up for. There's a ton of super practical projects that can be done within a university campus now just to start getting some literacies going. I'd really advocate for, be an AI builder, like be a product builder, create your own agent. Don't buy an agent from someone else necessarily. Create your own curriculum mapping processes. Create your own, adaptive feedback agent. Figure out how to synchronize and orchestrate multiple agents, but be AI builders first, because I sometimes, and I remember in the early 2000s as online learning was slowly picking up, and a few universities woke up and said, "Oh, this is something significant." But a lot of universities, due to sort of subpar leadership, didn't recognize, I have no idea why, but that digital learning would become a big thing. And in some cases, some campuses didn't even realize it until COVID hit. And so universities that failed to catch that on the horizon, they ended up having to pay out an enormous amount of money to OPMs to help them build their curriculum and start marketing their courses. So I guess part of my thinking here is if you don't become an AI product builder today, then you're going to have to buy that expertise in the future if you're not building it today. And I think there's massive benefits for us to get into the arena of being AI product creators and being more capable in our AI deployment as a whole. So I'll just go back to the two questions: the knowledge, skills, and ways of being that we want our learners to have, and how we're going to build and develop those. I think that's a fundamental question that every university should sort of be tasked with answering from that leadership level. And I'd advocate for two or for a three-tiered level of change. In tier one change, these can all be going on simultaneously, but you're solving a problem, but the core operations of the university remain unchanged. So you might add a chat bot, or you might digitize, use an agent to help create curriculum. Tier two is where you start making some pedagogical changes. So this could be rethinking your learning design. You might start to really grapple with what kinds of capabilities do learners need in an AI-centric world. But then ultimately, your tier three approaches are perhaps something that's done as a special initiative outside of the university. But it's this idea of what does a clean cloth innovation look like? And again, this is thinking that Paul LeBlanc has advanced at Southern New Hampshire University initially, and certainly in our thinking here, which is what if we don't have the legacy constraints of a university? What if we can build to the capabilities of AI, the affordances of technology, to the needs of the learner, to the needs of society? What if that's our orienting star rather than attending to the existing system? And there's no reason why even a reasonable sized state university couldn't build a separate organization that's staffed by a handful of people that has a vision to try and advance that AI capability. These aren't ridiculously expensive initiatives. In some cases, you're going to pay a bigger fee for some of your LLM provider costs or the AI tool sets that you're going to buy from big tech in that process. So a few practical actions to start thinking about is get clear on your AI strategic vision. So I'll start with the second point here is, deploy across all three levels. Have a vision, get clarity around what you think an educated person in society will look like in 5 years. What kind of work will she be doing? What kinds of technical, socio-emotional, and metacognitive skill sets, psychological attributes will she have to be successful? I do think universities should be hiring chief AI officers, not necessarily technical only. It should include someone who sits across multiple disciplines, but definitely needs technical capabilities. This isn't someone who is not familiar with AI, would not succeed in this role because you're going to be sitting across IT, industry, faculty, learning design, and other staff. And as I've already mentioned, be product builders. Like you can't overstate the value of some of those aspects. So a few follow-on resources. I do a roughly-ish weekly newsletter around just trends in AI. Some fantastic resources if you want to get a fundamental literacy started around, Andre Karpathy's work on deep dives into LLMs. And then 3 Blue, 1 Brown is one of my favorite YouTube channels on this. Everything from how LLMs are explained to how they might store facts and so on can be just a fantastic grounding. So that's roughly it. So it's a bit of a message for senior leadership in universities to get intentional about what AI does in their university by getting clarity around the ways that you feel learners need to be educated and the capabilities they need to have in a society that's emerging. And I think that's a task that should be the grounding direction. We shouldn't take our guidance from the latest AI tool that's been created by a foundation lab or by the latest salesperson that you hear talk at a conference about a fantastic new innovation. I think an AI strategy should be grounded in our vision for humanity as a sector. It should be grounded in our desire to help prepare learners for this future. It should be grounded in the expertise that sits within our own campuses, faculty, developers, learning designers and so on. But ultimately, it is a conversation that needs to be set and established by leadership in order for that to be effectively deployed. But ultimately, I think my plea is we got to get in the arena. The future of the university sector, the future of knowledge processes are emerging around us. They're being driven by organizations that often don't have the public facing obligations that universities do have. And so I think we need to take that responsibility to get into that arena and to start driving those conversations much more seriously than we've been taking it. And that again is where your boards, your presidents, and your provosts play a critical role.